The world shrinks to the space between my eye and the crosshair. The desert heat shimmers above the scrubland, distorting the target 600 yards away, a small, dark silhouette against the sun-bleached berm. The wind, a fickle partner today, whispers a constant, low hum in my ears, a sound I've learned to translate. Right now, it's telling me it's a 5-mile-an-hour crosswind, gusting occasionally to 8. I adjust my breathing, feeling the slow, deliberate rise and fall of my chest against the cool polymer stock of my M2010 enhanced sniper rifle. The scent of hot brass, burnt gunpowder, and dry earth is as familiar to me as my own skin. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold. The world goes silent. The chatter from the nearby firing line, the distant crack of pistols, the rustle of the dry creosote bushes, it all fades into a dull background hum. My focus is absolute. My finger rests lightly on the trigger, a feather's touch away from breaking the shot. I feel the subtle pulse in my neck, timing the space between heartbeats. There, in the pause, the world is still. I squeeze. The report is a sharp, concussive crack that echoes across the range. There's no dramatic follow-through needed, no second guess. I know before the spotters call. Through the scope, I see the small steel target spin violently on its mount, a satisfying pirouette of success. Damn, Lena, through the heart, again. David Chen's voice is close, a mix of admiration and playful exasperation. He lowers his binoculars. You're gonna bore a hole through that target if you keep this up. I ease back from the rifle, the tension leaving my shoulders. A small, private smile touches my lips. It's a good target, holds up well. The target's fine, David says, shaking his head. It's your consistency that's unnatural. You're making the rest of us look bad on a Saturday afternoon. I unload the rifle, the ritual as ingrained as breathing. Safety on, clear the chamber, visually and physically confirm. The brass cartridge is still warm in my palm as I pocket it. It's not a competition, Chen. Everything's a competition with you, Vance, he retorts, but he's grinning. You just don't like to admit it. He's not entirely wrong. The calm exterior I project is a hard-won discipline, a layer of ice over a deep well of competitive fire. I'd earned my spot, not through bluster, but through thousands of hours of practice, through mastering the variables that turn a near-impossible shot into a probable one. I was 28, a captain in the United States Army, and one of the youngest certified sniper school instructors at Fort Bragg. Every perfect shot was a quiet affirmation, a message written in ballistics for anyone who cared to read it. My actions were my voice. We were at the Long Shot, a civilian range about 40 minutes from post, a place where many of us went to escape the regimented atmosphere of the military ranges. It was a slice of the real world, a mix of seasoned veterans, enthusiastic hobbyists, and a few guys who thought a tactical vest and a fancy rifle made them operators. I preferred it. The pressure was off. It was just me, the rifle, and the fundamentals. That's when the other sound broke through my focus, a sound as predictable as the wind, the gruff, carrying baritone of Marcus Henderson. Mac, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, 62 years old if he was a day, and a regular at the Long Shot. He held court near the pistol bays, a grizzled patriarch surrounded by a group of younger, impressionable shooters. I could see them from our position, a cluster of camo ball caps and eager faces. And that's why you never, ever compromise your fundamentals, Mac was saying, jabbing a thick finger in the air for emphasis. Your stance is your foundation, your breathing is your rhythm. It's a science, not a game. You think those video games teach you anything? Hell no. They teach you instant gratification. Real shooting, real combat marksmanship, that's about patience, control. It's a mental game above all else. I exchanged a glance with David. He rolled his eyes skyward. We'd heard this particular sermon before. Mac wasn't a bad guy, not really. He loved the military, loved the Corps with a ferocity that was almost touching. But his worldview was a fossil, preserved in the amber of a bygone era. He was stubbornly traditional, and his old-school mentality often came with a side of casual, unexamined bias. I went back to my logbook, noting the distance, windage, and outcome of the shot. I was preparing to set up for a 750-yard attempt when I felt the audience shift. Mac's group had drifted closer, drawn by the distinctive report of the .300 Winchester Magnum. See now, that's a serious piece of hardware, Mac announced, as if providing color commentary for our session. The M2010, a soldier's rifle, not like these plastic toys you kids are buying. He clapped a young man on the shoulder. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, nodded vigorously, his eyes wide. He was lanky, with a fresh-faced eagerness that I recognized. This was Private First Class Jake Miller, one of the new soldiers who had recently been assigned to the battalion. I'd seen him around, a quiet kid who seemed to soak up every bit of information thrown his way. Right now, he was soaking up Mac. I ignored them, focusing on my preparations, but Mac wasn't done. "Course, a rifle's only as good as the shooter," he continued, his voice dropping into a confiding tone that still managed to carry. "And that's the thing most people don't get. It's not about strength. It's about nerve, about having that ice water in the veins composure. The patience to wait for days for one shot, not everyone is built for it." I felt David tense beside me. He's fiercely loyal, sometimes to a fault, and he had a low tolerance for Mac's brand of friendly advice, especially when it was directed at me. Mac took a few steps closer, his hands on his hips. "Afternoon, Captain, Sergeant." He nodded at each of us, a gesture that was meant to be respectful but always felt a little patronizing. "Nice grouping you're putting together over here." "Afternoon, Gunny," I said, my voice neutral. David just gave a tight nod. "You know," Mac said, addressing his captivated audience but looking directly at me with a condescending smile, "I was just telling these young men about the mental aspect of long-range shooting. It's a special kind of focus, a certain temperament." He paused, letting the word hang in the hot air. "I've seen a lot of good soldiers in my time, but the truly great snipers, well, they all share that same unshakable mindset. It's a rare thing." He took another step, now standing almost directly over my shooting mat. His shadow fell across my rifle. I remained kneeling, looking up at him, keeping my expression blank. I knew what was coming. It was a dance we'd done before. He gave me a look that was probably intended to be avuncular, but landed as profoundly smug. "No offense, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with a faux folksy charm that made my jaw tight. "You're a fine shot, I'll give you that, but real snipers, the ones who have what it takes to lie in the dirt for a week staring through a scope, they're all men, it's just biology. Women just don't have the mental fortitude for it. They're too emotional. It's not an insult, it's just a fact of life." The words hung there, stupid and heavy. "It's just biology." The phrase was so lazy, so intellectually barren that it was almost impressive. I could feel the eyes of the young shooters on me, especially Jake Miller's. I could guess what he was thinking. If a legend like Gunny Henderson said it, it must be true. David took a sharp breath. "For Christ's sake, Mac." I cut him off with a slight shake of my head, my eyes still locked on Mac's. My heart was thumping a slow, hard rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of pure annoyance. But letting that show was what he expected. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the emotional outburst that would, in his mind, prove his point. So I gave him nothing. I let the silence stretch for a 3 count, long enough to be noticeable, long enough for his smug smile to tighten just a fraction. Then I turned my head slightly, as if considering a mildly interesting cloud formation. "Wind's picking up," I said, my voice flat and calm. "Gusting to 10 now, makes the 750 interesting." Mac blinked, thrown by the complete non sequitur. The lack of engagement was a weapon he didn't know how to counter. His audience looked confused. I turned back to my rifle, a clear dismissal. "Appreciate the tip, Gunny." I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes before he covered it with a gruff chuckle. "Sure, Captain, sure, you just keep practicing." He turned back to his group, herding them away. "See what I mean? Gets a little sensitive. Now where were we? Fundamentals." As they moved off, I heard him launch into another lecture, his voice booming with restored confidence. I kept my eyes on my scope, my hands moving through the motions of preparing for the next shot, but my focus was shattered. David waited until they were out of earshot. "I cannot believe that guy," he hissed, sinking down onto the mat beside me. "It's just biology. What the hell does that even mean? Did he time travel from 1953? Lena, you should have said something. You should have told him about the time you outscored every single candidate in your class, including the all-army shooting team guy. You should have." "What, David?" I interrupted, my voice quieter than I intended. "Should I have listed my qualifications? My confirmed engagements? Should I have gone into a shouting match with a retired gunny in front of a bunch of privates? How would that have looked?" It would have looked like you standing up for yourself. He insisted, his face flushed with anger on my behalf. It would have looked like you not taking that condescending crap. It would have looked exactly like what he wanted, I said, finally looking at him. It would have been emotional. It would have proven his point in his mind. He baits you because he wants the reaction. The only way to win is not to play his game. David sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. I know you're right, it pisses me off. The guy's a dinosaur. And that kid, Miller, he's just soaking it all up. It's how this crap gets perpetuated. I knew he was right. That was the part that stung the most. It wasn't just Mac's ignorance, it was the fact that he was planting seeds in a new generation. Seeds of doubt, of limitation. I took a deep breath, the hot air burning in my lungs. The frustration was a live wire under my skin, but I refused to let it crackle to the surface. I was a sniper. I was patience. I was control. I finished my session, running through my drills with mechanical precision. The shots were still good, still tight groupings, but the joy was gone. It had become work. The silence between David and me on the drive back to post was thick with unspoken irritation. He finally broke it as we passed through the main gate, the MP saluting us through. You're handling it better than I would. I'm not handling it, I said, staring out the window at the familiar buildings of the base. I'm storing it. For what? I didn't have an answer. I just knew that the condescension, the casual dismissal of everything I had worked for, couldn't be the final word. Mac's challenge, though unspoken, lingered in the air. His eyes, lingering on me after his comment, had held more than just smugness. There was a testing quality to it, a gauntlet thrown down. He was confident in his superiority, in the unassailable rightness of his worldview. And as we pulled up to my quarters, the image that stayed with me wasn't of Mac's smug face, but of Jake Miller's. The young private, his head nodding along, absorbing the truth from a respected source. That was the real challenge. It wasn't about proving Mac wrong. It was about ensuring that the Jakes of the world saw a different truth. But how? A direct confrontation was useless. It had to be something else. Something undeniable. I got out of the car, the weight of my rifle case feeling heavier than usual. Thanks for the ride, David. Any time, he said, his expression still concerned. Don't let it get to you, Lena. I gave him a nod and closed the door. But as I walked toward my room, the words echoed in my head. Real snipers are all men, sweetheart, it's just biology. They weren't just an insult. They were a declaration of war fought on a battlefield I hadn't chosen. And I knew with a cold, certain clarity that this wasn't over. The unspoken tension Mac had established today demanded a response, not with words but with action. The question was, what action would be enough? The scent of cordite and hot brass was a ghost on the wind, a week-old memory stubbornly clinging to the fabric of my uniform. Out on the range, with the desert sun a brutal, honest weight, things were simple. The math was clean, the outcome a direct result of discipline and control. Here, in the dappled shade of the training woods behind the main base, the equations were far more complex. The variables had names, and egos, and preconceived notions that were a hell of a lot harder to zero than any rifle. The difference between a good position and a compromised one, I said, my voice cutting through the humid Georgia air, isn't measured in inches. It's measured in seconds. The seconds it takes for an enemy spotter to pick out the unnatural line of your barrel, the shimmer of your scope. I moved down the line of prone soldiers, a dozen green-clad forms pressed into the pine needle carpet. My boots made no sound. That was a habit drilled into me long before I ever thought of drilling it into others. I stopped behind Private First Class Jake Miller. His body was taut, a bowstring pulled too tight. He'd chosen a firing position behind a fallen log, which was textbook, but he'd failed to clear the spiderweb of low-hanging branches directly in front of his muzzle. The morning sun, slanting through the leaves, would catch the mirage from his barrel with the first shot, painting a bright, shiny target on his forehead for anyone watching. Miller, I said, my tone even devoid of accusation. It was a statement of fact. Your mirage, the branches. He shifted his head slightly, his cheek still welded to the stock of his M4. Ma'am, the manual says primary cover takes precedence. The log provides optimal protection. A flicker of irritation, hot and quick, ignited in my gut. I smothered it. He was quoting doctrine, but he was quoting it like a parrot, without understanding the spirit behind the words. It was the same rigid, by-the-book thinking I'd heard in Mac's voice out on the range. The way things are done. Protection is useless if you're dead before you fire, I replied, keeping my voice low so only our little group could hear. The manual assumes you've also mastered the skill of not announcing your position to the entire battlefield. Clear the branches, create a clean firing lane. For a heartbeat, just one, he didn't move. It wasn't outright insubordination, it was a hesitation, a silent questioning of the order's validity simply because it came from me. I saw the set of his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes. He was 19, his face still soft with youth, but his mind was already being etched with the grooves of a culture he was just beginning to navigate. I knew that look. It was the look of a boy who'd been listening to old men in VFW halls, men like Mac, who spoke of a time when things were simpler, when roles were clearly defined, and women didn't correct your firing stance. Then the moment broke. "Yes, Captain," he muttered, and reached forward to snap the twigs. I moved on, my calm mask firmly in place, but inside, the memory surfaced like a sudden, sharp rock in a slow-moving stream. It was the same feeling, that subtle resistance, a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my time at the schoolhouse. The air at Fort Benning had been just as thick but colder, a damp chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there for the 7 weeks of sniper school. It wasn't the physical hell of ranger school, it was a quieter, more insidious torture. It was the pressure of constant, silent scrutiny. 60 of us started, a mix of ranks and services, but only a handful of women. We were anomalies, and every pair of eyes, instructor and student alike, was a gauge measuring us for failure. My spotter during the stalking phase was a staff sergeant from the 82nd, a man built like a refrigerator with hands like smoked hams. He never said a word against me. He didn't have to. I saw it in the way he double-checked my range estimations, the slight pause before he relayed my wind calls. The burden of proof was on me, a weight I carried in addition to the 50-pound ruck, the ghillie suit that scratched like a burlap sack full of insects, and the M24 rifle that became an extension of my own anxious skeleton. The stalk was the crucible. You had 1,000 meters to cross, using only the barest folds in the earth for cover, to get within 200 meters of an observation tower full of instructors with high-powered scopes. Every movement was a calculated risk. An inch too high, a shift too fast, and a red flag would wave, signaling your failure, your death. I remember one stalk in particular, through a Georgia swamp. The water was ice gold, layered with a skin of rotten leaves. The smell was a potent mix of decay and mud. For 3 hours, I inched forward, my body submerged, my rifle held above the murky water. Leeches found their way onto my legs, a sensation I learned to ignore. The cold was a live wire, shocking my system, threatening to trigger uncontrollable shivers. My mind screamed at me to move, to get up, to get warm. But discipline was a louder voice. It was a mantra: slow is smooth, smooth is fast, breathe, control. I focused on the infinitesimal, the pattern of the reeds, the whisper of the wind, the distant, bored chatter of the instructors in the tower, their voices carrying over the still water. I became a part of the swamp, a log, a mound of mud. I moved only when the wind gusted, masking the slight ripple I made. It took me 4 hours to cover that 1,000 meters. When I finally settled into my final firing position, a mere 150 meters from the tower, my body was numb, a block of ice. But my mind was crystal clear. I saw the instructor, a master sergeant with a face like etched granite, lift his scope. He scanned my area. His binoculars paused, moved on, then came back. He was good. He'd seen something, a shape that didn't quite match. He stared for a full minute, and in that minute I didn't breathe. I became the earth itself. Finally, he lowered his glasses, shook his head slightly at his colleague, and turned away. He hadn't identified me. I had won that silent, invisible battle. The shot, when I finally took it, was almost an afterthought. A clean hit. When I stood up, mud-slathered and shaking with cold, the same master sergeant looked at me, and for the first time there was no skepticism in his eyes. There was, if not respect, a simple, professional acknowledgement. I had passed his test. I had earned my place, not because of a quota, but because I had endured the same misery, mastered the same skills, and possessed the same bottomless well of patience as anyone else who wore the tab. But I'd had to prove it, over and over, in a way that most of the men never did. The memory receded, leaving behind the familiar ache of old fatigue and a renewed sense of resolve. The challenge with Miller wasn't about a single stalk or a single shot. It was about the same grinding process of proof. Later that afternoon, we were setting up for a tactical field exercise, a simulated reconnaissance and surveillance mission. The objective was to observe a mock enemy patrol route without being detected. David Chen was running the opposition force, the aggressors, and I knew he'd be merciless. That's why I valued him. I was briefing my squad, a mixture of experienced corporals and the new privates like Miller, when a familiar, no-nonsense voice cut through the planning. "Captain Vance, a moment." Major Sarah Briggs stood a few yards away, her hands clasped behind her back. She wore the same faded DCU pattern as the rest of us, but her authority was like a force field. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun that highlighted sharp, intelligent features, and her eyes missed nothing. "Carry on with prep, Sergeant," I said to the senior NCO and walked over to her. "Ma'am." She led me just out of earshot, under the canopy of a large oak. "How's the new crop?" she asked, her gaze scanning the soldiers. It lingered for a fraction of a second on Miller, who was fumbling with the lens caps on his spotting scope. "They're green," I said neutrally. "Some are greener than others, but the fundamentals are there. They just need to learn to think, not just recite." Briggs gave a short, sharp nod. "The good ones always do. It's the unlearning that's the hard part. Unlearning bad habits, unlearning preconceptions." She turned her head, fixing me with a look that was both supportive and piercing. "I heard about your shot last week. Impressive, even for you. Chen couldn't stop talking about it at the O Club." I felt a flicker of pride, but kept my expression flat. "It was a good day, ma'am. Conditions were favorable." "Don't sell yourself short, Alina," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. "Your precision is a command-level asset. Never forget that. There are still those," she paused, her eyes flicking back towards the squad, "who will only see the uniform, not the soldier inside it. Your job is to be so damn good that they can't afford to be blind. It's an unfair burden, but it's the one we carry. You're not just teaching them how to shoot, you're teaching them how to see." Her words were a direct echo of my own thoughts, a validation that landed with the weight of truth. She wasn't just my she was a mentor who had navigated these same waters long before I'd enlisted. Her confidence was a rock I could anchor to. "Understood, ma'am," I said. "Good, now go make sure they don't walk into one of Chen's obvious ambushes. I expect a full AAR by 1800. With a final, appraising look, she turned and walked away, her departure as crisp as her arrival. The exercise began an hour later. We moved as a team, but my role was as a sniper element, providing overwatch as the main reconnaissance team advanced toward the observation point. Miller was attached to me as my spotter for the exercise. It was a test for both of us. We found a vantage point on a wooded ridge overlooking a dirt track. The setup was smooth, practiced. I went through my routine, building a steady prone position, mapping the wind with the mirage, calculating the mild drops and angles. Miller lay beside me, his breathing a little too quick and shallow. "Range to the crossroads?" I asked him quietly, my eye pressed to the scope of the M2010. He fumbled with the rangefinder. "Us 420 meters, ma'am." "Confirm it, use the mil-dot formula, don't rely on the electronics." It was a lesson Mac would have approved of, the old-school way. He blushed, a flush of red creeping up his neck, and did the math manually. "Confirmed, Fort Wenty." We lay in silence for 20 minutes. The woods were alive with the sounds of insects and distant birds. Then, movement. David Chen's aggressor squad, moving with a discipline that was entirely realistic, came down the track. They were using the cover well, but from our angle, I had a clear view. "Targets identified," I whispered. 5 personnel. Lead element is 20 meters from the checkpoint. Mark targets 1 through 5. Miller marked them, his voice growing steadier as he fell into the rhythm of the work. "Confirmed, 1 through 5. This was the critical moment. Our job was to observe and report, not engage. But Chen, playing his role to the hilt, had his squad paws right in the kill zone. They were setting up a simulated mortar position. If they completed it, they would have indirect fire on the entire area, including our advancing recon team, which was now moving into a vulnerable position. "They're digging in," Miller hissed, a note of panic in his voice. "We need to call it in. They're going to see our guys." Wait, I said, my voice calm. I tracked the lead aggressor, a corporal who was clearly in charge. He was checking his positioning, looking down at his map. He was competent, but he'd made a mistake. He depositioned himself with a large rock at his back, a classic error that limited his field of view. I could see the flank of our recon team, led by a sharp corporal, beginning to edge around to the left, completely unseen by the aggressors. But Captain there. Miller, I cut him off, my tone leaving no room for argument. Watch the flank, trust the drill. He fell silent. I could feel the tension radiating from him. He saw a simple problem: enemy in the open, friendly forces advancing. He wanted a simple solution: call a warning. But the battlefield is never simple. A premature transmission could reveal our position and doom the entire flanking maneuver. It was a test of patience, of seeing the whole board, not just one piece. I waited, my breathing slow, and even my finger resting lightly outside the trigger guard. I watched the recon team move with painstaking slowness into a perfect assault position. The lead aggressor finally stood up, satisfied with his mortar emplacement. He was about to give the order to fire. Just as he opened his mouth, I keyed my radio, my voice a low, clear whisper. All elements, this is Overwatch. Enemy mortar team at checkpoint Delta. They are fixed. Assault team, you are clear to engage on my mark. Stand by, mark. The woods erupted with the simulated crackle of blank gunfire from the concealed recon team. The aggressors, caught completely by surprise, were eliminated in seconds. The exercise was a total success. We packed our gear in silence and moved down to the crossroads for the after-action review. David Chen was there, pulling off his aggressor armband. He shot me a look, a mixture of professional irritation and genuine respect. You waited us out, Captain. That was a hell of a risk. It was a calculated one, I said. He nodded, then glanced at Miller, who was standing a few feet away, looking shell-shocked. Your spotter keep his cool. Before I could answer, Miller stepped forward. His face was pale, but his eyes were different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning, almost unsettling clarity. She, Captain Vance, knew, he said, his voice quiet but firm. She knew the whole time. I was ready to call it in, but she saw it, the whole thing. He wasn't talking to Chen anymore. He was talking to himself, processing the lesson that no amount of lecture could ever truly impart. It was a lesson written in the language of action, the only language that ever truly mattered. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a woman or a captain. He saw a sniper. The ghost of the schoolhouse, the memory of the freezing swamp, had done its work. It was only a crack in his armor, but it was a start. The echo of that single, patient shot from a week ago seemed to hang in the air between us, finally finding its target. The familiar scent of hops, number 9 solvent, and old wood greeted me as I pushed open the door to the civilian range, a place that had started to feel less like a refuge and more like a proving ground. 2 months had passed since the exercise with Miller in the woods. The memory of his hesitant nod, the unspoken question in his eyes, still lingered like a stubborn ghost. I'd worked with him since, seen flickers of progress, but the rigid shadow of Mac's influence was a persistent thing, clinging to the young private like a burr. David Chen was already there, his own rifle case propped against a bench. He gave me a tight, knowing smile as I approached. The usual suspects already zeroing in, he murmured, his eyes flicking toward the far end of the firing line. I didn't need to look. Mac Henderson's presence was a physical force in the space, a low-frequency hum of entrenched opinion. I could see him, a solid, immovable figure in a worn-out USMC sweatshirt, methodically running a bore snake through his vintage M1A. The air itself felt thick, charged with the unspoken tension of our last encounter, a Cold War fought with silence and sidelong glances. Figured, I said, setting my own Pelican case on the bench next to David's. The latches clicked open with a satisfyingly solid sound. Miller texted me, said he was coming down to get some extra practice in, wanted to work on his positional shooting. David's smile faded into a look of mild concern. Oh boy, that's a recipe for something. He asked for help, I said, the words feeling flimsy even as I said them. I started assembling my rifle, the ritual of it a calming anchor, the smooth slide of the upper receiver into the lower, the precise click as I seated the bolt carrier group. Each motion was a prayer for patience. Help from you or help in general. David asked, his perception as sharp as ever. Before I could answer, the door creaked open again, and Private Jake Miller stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He looked younger than his 19 years, his uniform crisp, his posture eager. He spotted me and gave a quick, respectful nod. "Captain Vance, Sergeant Chen." "At ease, Miller," I said. "Glad you could make it." His eyes darted past me, toward Mac. A familiar, almost involuntary movement. Mac, sensing the attention, looked up from his rifle. A slow, paternal grin spread across his weathered face. "Well, look who it is. The motivated private," Mac's voice boomed, cutting through the quiet range chatter. "Come to learn from the old guard, son." Miller flushed, a mix of pride and awkwardness. "Just here to practice, gunny." "That's the spirit. None of this newfangled coddling. Fundamentals, it's all about the fundamentals." Mac waved him over. "Let's see that rifle. Bet you're still fighting that flinch." I felt David tense beside me. I placed a hand lightly on my bipod, the cold metal a grounding sensation. This was Miller's choice. He had to navigate this himself. I watched as the private walked over to Mac's bench, holding out his M4 like a supplicant. Mac took the rifle, his hands moving over it with a gruff familiarity. "See this?" he said, his voice carrying easily. "Your sling attachment is all wrong for a proper hasty sling. You want it tight, high on the arm, creates a solid bone-on-bone support. None of this loosey-goosey stuff they're teaching now." He began demonstrating, wrapping the sling around his own arm with a practiced twist. It was a direct contradiction to what I'd taught Miller. My method, developed through hours in hide sites where a too-tight sling could impede a rapid shift to a secondary target, emphasized a faster, more adaptable loop. It wasn't better or worse, just different. A tool for a different kind of problem. But to Mac, difference was deficiency. Miller listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. He shot a quick, uncertain glance in my direction. "Go on, try it," Mac urged, handing the rifle back. Miller shouldered the weapon, cinching the sling the way Mac had shown him. He assumed a standing position, the classic offhand drill. I could see the strain in his posture immediately. The position was rigid, unforgiving. "Tighter," Mac commanded. "Lock it in. You're a tripod, son, not a blade of grass." I set my own rifle down. The sound of the action closing was softer than a sigh. I walked over, my steps deliberate. "The position is creating unnecessary muscle tension, Private," I said, my voice level. "It'll induce fatigue faster, increase the microshakes." Mac's head swiveled toward me, his eyes narrowing. The air grew several degrees colder. "Fatigue builds discipline, Captain. A little shaking teaches a man to control his body. You can't learn to be steady without first understanding what it means to be unsteady." "There's a difference between disciplined strength and wasted energy," I replied, keeping my focus on Miller. "In a sustained observation, that fatigue becomes a liability. The goal is efficiency of motion, not just brute force stability." Miller was frozen, his rifle held awkwardly, his eyes darting between us like he was watching a tennis match. Mac let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Efficiency, that's a word for people who want to cut corners. The fundamentals don't change. Marines have been winning fights with this technique since Korea. It works. And soldiers have been adapting techniques since the Revolution," I countered, a edge of steel creeping into my calm. "The battlefield changes. The tools change. Why shouldn't the techniques?" "Because the man behind the rifle doesn't change?" Mac's voice rose, his face flushing. "The principles of marksmanship are timeless. Breath control, trigger squeeze, sight alignment. You don't mess with the gospel." "I'm not messing with the gospel, Mac. I'm offering a different interpretation of the scripture. One based on 6 years of combat deployment and 2 years of teaching the Army's best snipers." The words were out before I could filter them, my quiet pride flaring into defiance. The range had gone quiet. A few other shooters were watching us now. David moved to my side, a solid, silent presence of support. Mac's eyes blazed. He took a step closer, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. "See, that's what I'm talking about. Your experience. You talk about it like it's the only thing that matters. You think a couple of tour and a piece of paper from some school gives you the right to rewrite the book? What qualifies you, a woman, to tell me about the fundamentals of combat marksmanship?" The unspoken word hung in the air, louder than if he'd shouted it. Girl. It was there in the condescension, in the way he framed my gender as an inherent disqualifier. David stepped forward, his easygoing demeanor gone, replaced by a protective anger. Gunny, that's out of line. Captain Vance's record speaks for itself. You have no idea what you're talking about. It's okay, David, I said, my voice suddenly, strangely calm. The red-hot anger I'd felt a moment ago had cooled into a solid, glacial certainty. This was the core of it. This was the root of all the sidelong glances, the subtle challenges, the constant need to prove my worth. It wasn't about the sling or the mirage or any specific technique. It was about this single, stubborn question. Mac mistook my calm for surrender. No, let him speak. I want to know, I really do. What makes you the expert, Captain? What's your ultimate qualification? I looked at him, at the entrenched certainty in his face. I looked at Miller, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. I saw the path behind me, a trail of sweat and blood and exhaustion leading to this exact moment. Without a word, I turned and walked back to my bench. The sound of my footsteps on the wooden planks was the only noise in the hushed range. I knelt down, unzipped the main compartment of my range bag. Past the boxes of match-grade ammunition, past the cleaning kits and data books, my fingers found the hard, smooth edge of a simple wooden frame tucked into a protective sleeve. I pulled it out and walked back to the center of the tension, the space between the benches that felt like a no-man's land. Mac was still glaring, his chest puffed out, waiting for an answer. David watched me, his expression shifting from anger to curiosity. I placed the frame face down on the worn wooden bench between us. The sound of wood on wood was a soft, final thud. Then slowly, I turned it over. The photograph was 5 years old. The colors were a little faded, the gloss finish bearing the fine scratches of being moved from footlocker to office and back again. It showed a line of 12 men and 1 woman, all in dirty combat uniforms, their faces smudged with grease paint and etched with a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. They stood in front of a simple wooden sign, United States Army Sniper School, Fort Benning. I was in the center, looking younger, thinner. My hair was pulled back in a tight, messy bun, stray wisps stuck to my sweat-streaked temples. My eyes, though tired, held a fierce, hard-won light. In my arms, I cradled my M2010 enhanced sniper rifle as if it were a part of me. Below the image, in stark white lettering, were our names and the class number. And centered at the bottom, the 2 words that represented 7 of the most grueling weeks of my life. Sniper School Graduate. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper than the quiet between shots. It was a vacuum, sucking the sound, the anger, the very air out of the room. Mac's eyes dropped to the photo. His bluster, his righteous indignation, evaporated from his face like mist in a sudden wind. His jaw went slack. He stared, his gaze locked on the image, on my face in that line of grimy, triumphant soldiers. I saw the calculations happening behind his eyes, the rapid, painful reassessment of everything he thought he knew. A Marine gunnery sergeant, especially one of his generation, understood the significance of that photo in a way a civilian never could. He knew the attrition rate. He knew the price of admission. He knew that the woman standing before him had not just attended a course, she had survived a crucible. His eyes lifted from the photo to my face, then back down again, as if comparing the weary soldier in the frame to the calm, composed officer in front of him. The first crack appeared in the granite of his worldview, a fissure of pure, unadulterated shock. There was no disdain left, no condescension, just a dawning, humbling disbelief. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The photograph spoke a language he was forced to understand. It spoke of sand and sleep deprivation, of wind calls and ballistics calculations, of holding a crosswind for a shot that mattered. It spoke of a qualification that could not be argued with. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jake Miller. He was staring at the photo with a look of utter revelation. The last of his unconscious bias, the lingering doubt seeded by Mac's offhand comments, seemed to melt away, replaced by a raw, unvarnished respect. He wasn't just looking at a picture, he was seeing the unspoken truth of my authority for the first time. David let out a slow, quiet breath beside me. I could feel his pride, a warm, solid thing in the chilly silence. Mac finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. The fight was gone from them. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. He just stood there, a 62-year-old man who had built his identity on a certain set of assumptions and watched them crumble into dust. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, not in denial, but in stunned acceptance. I reached out and picked up the photograph. The wood of the frame was warm from my hands. I held it for a moment, allowing the weight of it to be felt by everyone present, then I turned and slid it back into the protective sleeve in my bag. The action was final, the period at the end of a sentence he had started. The range remained quiet, the usual sounds of shooting still suspended. The confrontation was over. There were no winners, only a landscape of understanding that had been irrevocably altered. I zipped my bag closed, the sound a soft, decisive whisper in the deafening silence. The air on the range was different now. It was still the same burnt cordite and hot metal, the same dry, dusty scent of the Georgia clay baking under a late afternoon sun, the same low thrum of distant traffic, but the silence between the shots had changed. It wasn't a tense, waiting silence anymore, pregnant with judgment. It was a working quiet, a comfortable, shared focus. 3 months had sanded down the rough edges of that initial confrontation, leaving behind a smoother, if not entirely even, surface. I watched Jake Miller settle into his prone position behind the Remington 700, his movements more fluid, more confident. He didn't fumble with the bipod legs. He didn't need to check his data book 3 times. He inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that lifted his shoulders and let it out halfway. The shot broke clean, a sharp, concise crack that echoed once and was swallowed by the berm. "Hit," I said, my eye pressed to the spotting scope. 8 o'clock on the 300-yard silhouette, a little jerky on the trigger. You're anticipating. Your body knows the recoil is coming and it's trying to get ahead of it. Don't fight it. Just let the surprise happen. He chambered another round, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes, Captain." I saw Mac before I heard him. A familiar shape in my peripheral vision, a stoic figure leaning against his truck, arms crossed. He'd been watching for the last 10 minutes, a spectator to our session. This had become his new routine. He didn't offer commentary. He didn't try to interject. He just observed, his presence no longer a looming threat but a curious, almost institutional fixture. The retired gunny, keeping an eye on things. Jake sent another round downrange. The steel target, a 12-inch square at 400 yards, rang with a satisfying ping. "Good," I said. "That's the one. Remember that feeling. The trigger should be a thought, not an action." Jake looked up, a genuine, unforced smile breaking through his focus. "I felt that one. It was smooth." "It was," I agreed. "Do it 5 more times." As Jake settled back into his rhythm, Mac pushed off from his truck and started walking over. His gait was slow, deliberate. Not the purposeful stride of a man coming to deliver a critique, but something more hesitant. He stopped a respectful few yards from my shooting mat, waiting for an acknowledgement. I looked up from the spotting scope, shielding my eyes from the sun with my hand. "Gunny." "Captain," he replied, his voice its usual gravelly tone. He nodded toward the distant targets. "The kid's coming along. He's putting in the work." "That he is." Mac fell silent, his eyes tracking a hawk circling high above the range. The silence wasn't hostile. It was full. He was working his way up to something. I let him stew. Patience, I had learned, was the one round you never ran out of. He cleared his throat, a rough, dry sound. "I got a new piece, a .308, Bergara. Fellow at the shop talked me into it, said it was the cat's meow for precision." I just waited. He hadn't come over to tell me about his new rifle. "Thing is," he continued, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, "the groups, well, they ain't what the brochure said they'd be. I've tried 3 different loads. Nothing's singing." He looked at me then, a direct look that held none of the old challenge. It was the look of one craftsman admitting a puzzle to another. It wasn't an apology for past behavior. It was something far more meaningful in his world, a request for a consult. "What's your 0?" I asked. 100 yards, dead on. "And at 2. Opens up to about, well, closer to 2 MOA than I'd like. Got a flyer that was plain ugly." "Consistently, or just the one group?" "Last 2 times out, consistently inconsistent." I glanced at Jake, who was meticulously logging his shots, completely absorbed. "All right, let's take a look." We walked over to his shooting bench. The rifle was a beauty, a Bergara B14 HMR with a sleek gray stock and a Vortex optic. It was a serious piece of equipment, not some safe queen. He'd clearly invested in it. He handled it with a reverence I understood, placing it on the bench bags with a care that belied his rough exterior. "Walk me through your procedure," I said, stepping back to let him work. He went through it, a perfect mirror of the doctrine he'd lived by for 40-odd years. Solid shoulder weld, consistent cheek pressure, slow breath control. The shot broke. Through my binos, I saw the hit on paper at 100 yards. It was a good shot, but not a great one. "Again," I said. He fired a 5-round string. The group was respectable for most shooters, about 1.2 MOA. But for a rifle of this caliber and a shooter of his experience, it was underperforming. "May I asked, gesturing to the rifle. He nodded, stepping aside. "Be my guest." The weight of the rifle was familiar, the balance excellent. I dry-fired it once, feeling the trigger break. It was crisp, clean. I settled into the bench, making a show of getting comfortable, but my mind was already working through the variables. It wasn't the shooter. It wasn't the trigger. That left the ammunition or the barrel. I loaded a single round, the brass cool and smooth against my fingers. I found my natural point of aim, let my breathing settle, and focused on the very center of the target, letting the crosshairs float ever so slightly. The world narrowed to the circle of the scope. The shot surprised me, as it always should. The report echoed. I stayed in the scope watching the target, a dead center hit. "Well, I'll be," Mac muttered, looking through his own spotting scope. "Again," I said. I fired 4 more rounds, taking my time between each one, letting the barrel cool. Each shot was a repetition of the same perfect process. When I was done, I safed the rifle and handed it back to him. "Your scope's a fraction off. A few clicks right, but that's not your main problem." He was staring through the spotter at the target. The group was a tight, ragged cloverleaf, easily half the size of his. "Then what is?" "It's not you, and it's not the rifle. It's your ammo. You're using a 168 grain match round, right?" "Yeah, federal gold medal match, always have." "This barrel might prefer a heavier bullet. Try a 175 grain, or hand loads if you're set up for it. The twist rate on these Bergaras is a bit faster. It'll stabilize a heavier projectile better." I pointed at the target. "The rifle can do that, consistently. You just have to feed it what it likes to eat." He was silent for a long moment, just looking from the target to the rifle and back again. He ran a hand over the stock, a thoughtful gesture. When he looked at me, his expression was unreadable. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was an acceptance, an acknowledgement that the data was irrefutable. 175 grain, he repeated, committing it to memory. "I'll give it a shot." He picked up his rifle and gear. "Appreciate the second set of eyes, Captain." "Anytime, Gunny." He walked back to his truck, his step a little lighter. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic admission that he'd been wrong about me. That wasn't his language. His language was ballistics and group size. His request for help and his acceptance of my diagnosis was the only translation of respect I would ever get from him. And for the first time, I found it was enough. It was more than enough. I walked back to where Jake was packing up his gear, the session over. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long, deep shadows across the range. The heat of the day was finally starting to break. "Everything okay with Mr. Henderson?" Jake asked, his voice cautious. The history there was still fresh for him. "Everything's fine," I said, and meant it. He just needed a little help with a new rifle. Jake zipped up his rifle case. "I heard what you said to him, about the ammunition. I wouldn't have thought of that." "You will, it's all part of the puzzle. The rifle, the round, the scope, the environment, and the shooter, they all have to be in harmony. A flaw in any one of them and the song falls apart." I leaned against my own truck, watching him. "You've come a long way in 5 months, Private. You're not the same shooter who showed up here that first day." He ducked his head, a little embarrassed. "I had a good teacher." "You had a willing student. That's the half of it I can't teach." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "When you first got here, you saw a pair of boots, a rank, and other things. You saw what you were told to see, what you were expected to see. What do you see now?" He looked up, his young face serious. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the target's downrange, at the setting sun glinting off the spent brass scattered on the ground, then finally back at me. "I see a sniper," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Sir." The word hung in the air between us, simple and absolute. It wasn't about me being a woman or him being a man. It was about the target and the unwavering discipline required to hit it. He wasn't trying to flatter me. He was stating a fact he had arrived at on his own through observation and evidence. He had done the math, and the answer was clear. "That's all that matters out here," I said softly. "That's all that ever mattered. The weapon isn't the rifle, Jake. It's the discipline, the patience, the will to control every variable, starting with yourself. That's the only thing that gets the job done. Everything else is just noise." He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. It was a lesson that went far beyond the firing line. "Yes, Captain." "Get out of here. I'll see you at PT at 600. "Thank you, Captain Vance." He shouldered his gear and headed for his car, his posture straighter, his bearing that of a soldier who finally knows his place is earned, not given. I was alone on the range. The silence was complete now, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. The light was turning to gold, painting the world in soft, forgiving tones. I unzipped my own rifle case, the familiar weight of my M2010 a comfort in my hands. I didn't need to fire it. I just wanted to feel it. I sat down on the dusty ground, my back against the warm tire of my truck, and laid the rifle across my knees. I traced the familiar contours of the stock, the cool precision of the Schmidt and Bender scope. This tool, this instrument of such specific, brutal purpose, had been the catalyst for everything. It had been a wall between me and men like Mac, a symbol of a world they thought I didn't belong in. And now, it was a bridge. It was the constant. My skill with it was the one immutable fact that could not be argued against, dismissed, or patronized. It was just there, as solid and real as the ground beneath me. I thought of the long road that had led me here, the countless hours of dry-fire practice in my barracks room, the grueling selection course, the feeling of my body screaming for rest while my mind screamed to continue. The first time I'd made a 1,000-yard shot in a crosswind, the thrill of seeing the hit through the scope, a feeling of pure, unadulterated competence that was better than any praise. I had done that. My discipline. My patience. The sun dipped below the tree line, and the world was bathed in a deep, peaceful blue. The heat of the day faded, replaced by a cool evening breeze that carried the scent of pine. A few early stars began to prick the darkening sky. There was no more tension. No need to prove anything to anyone. Mac's grudging respect, Jake's hard-won admiration, Major Briggs's unwavering support, David's loyal friendship. They were all acknowledgments of a truth I had always known in my bones. I was a soldier. I was a sniper. The validation I had once, perhaps, secretly craved from the old guard now seemed irrelevant. The only validation that ever truly mattered was the one I gave myself every time I picked up my rifle and performed to the standard I had set for myself. I sat there for a long time, watching the night settle over the range. The targets were just vague shapes in the gloom, the distances meaningless in the dark. But I knew they were there. I knew their exact positions, their precise ranges. The knowledge was a quiet, steady hum in the back of my mind. It was the peace I had fought for. It was the peace I had earned. And as the first crickets began to sing, I finally felt it, simple and whole and mine.